Hello and welcome to Yesteryear's Macs, where today we're going to take a look at a particular Macintosh with a form factor firmly confined to the history books. Flat and wide, the Quadra 610 is a pizza box Macintosh from early 1994. It could be considered a revision 2, as the machine originally released a year prior branded as a Centris. The improvement this Quadra boasts is in the processor department. This one has a 25 MHz 68040, whereas the original configuration had a 20 MHz 68LC040. The lack of an LC in this processor's name means that it contains a floating point unit, enabling much faster mathematical calculations. This was mostly used for high-end scientific applications, data crunching in spreadsheets, and Tristan, oddly enough. The ball physics are all numbers, so make heavy use of it, although for whatever reason, the follow-ups don't need it, despite being far more advanced visually. There were a few other tweaks in terms of memory and hard drive loadouts, but that's by the by, in my opinion, as those are easily upgradable. The Centris and Quadra 610s then can generally be considered one and the same. The 5 MHz speed bump and name switch seems to have happened fairly quietly. I couldn't find any announcement in Mac magazines about it. The 25 MHz configuration, however, was fairly short-lived, briefly retailing between £1,400 and £1,800 before being replaced by the Power Mac 6100, which used the same case, and its more direct successor, the 630. The Centris and Quadra brands came about as a result of the adoption of the 68040 chips over its preceding 68030s. You'd have to assume that it was a marketing decision to introduce a new set of names to signal a significant change like this, which brought into existence the Quadra brand for high-end products, and Centris models taking over from the Macintosh IIsi as the mid-range offering. The IIsi's case is a lovely looking thing, but it was unsuited to one incoming demand. There was nowhere to put a CD drive. One could assume that the flat pizza box form factor was a direct reaction to this, putting the machine's 3 drives, that's hard floppy and optical, in a line across the front. This particular unit is fitted with a 160 MB hard disk, which, while by no means the sickliest sounding drive I have, is old enough to drop dead at any moment. In addition, it's SCSI, so a like-for-like replacement will be both difficult to find and expensive. These are best replaced with a SCSI to SD solution. The CD drive, which was optional, takes the form of a short-lived loading solution which, while novel to use now, thankfully died out fairly quickly. There's no loading tray here. Instead, the user pops their disks into a caddy. I broke the release mechanism for mine. Stupid brittle plastic. Be careful with these. The whole thing can then be shoved into the drive, and I find it neat how it has different covers to display whether or not the drive is occupied. This is a double-speed CD drive, with its manual stating that the average access time is 295 milliseconds. Quite what practical use that information is to anyone is debatable, but it's that kind of pointless detail that I really like. Around the back are all the lovely ports for users to stick things in. These are power in, very important, power out, to stop the monitor taking up another plug socket, a DB15 socket for video out, a DB25 port for external SCSI, a bizarre-looking port called AAUI which handles Ethernet, which is about one of the only home-cooked proprietary ports that Apple did that made sense, as there was all sorts of networking standards back then, with this thing being able to talk to pretty much all of them, with the right dongle of course. Next to that are 2 serial ports which work with both RS232 and RS422 standards, 2 ADB ports, I'm not sure why, most Macs had 1, and the devices are daisy-chainable up to 3. Speakers or headphones out, microphone in, and finally the restart and interrupt switch. The latter is actually quite important for my machine. See, this Mac is one of a handful that doesn't seem to support soft power, as in, I can't turn it on with the keyboard. Instead relying on a big round button on the bottom right that new users allegedly often accidentally pressed, trying to eject the floppy. In addition, upon crashing, the 610 can't be forced restarted with Control-Command Power like most other Macs. Pressing the physical button wouldn't be that big a deal if my machine had a working clock battery, but this was the first thing to come out when I got it. So every time it locked up, I had to switch it off, switch it back on again, wait for it to boot up, adjust the mouse tracking speed back up to a usable level, turn 32-bit addressing back on, and then reboot again. Hitting the restart button in comparison meant that these options weren't lost. The keyboard I got with this is an Apple Keyboard 2. It looks pretty neat, but its compact footprint comes with some sacrifices. There's no page up or down, numlock, print screen, or any function key whatsoever. The arrow keys are placed horizontally, and next to those is the stupidest place I've ever seen an escape key, right next to the spacebar. Its saving grace is that it feels better to type on than its much larger and significantly more prevalent successor. I also quite like how instead of an LED, the caps lock will remain slightly recessed when active, much like a typewriter. Perched on top of the Mac is the monitor I got it with. It's era-appropriate, although the dimensions of the base better line up with the IIsi and LC Macintoshes. With a locked vertical refresh rate of 66.7 Hz, it is sadly beyond my equipment and budget to film without a flicker. If anyone's able to shed light on what the benefits of this over 60 Hz was, please leave a comment. Thankfully, the right adapter with the right dip switch settings enables the 610 to output VGA and SVGA resolutions quite happily, so it will work with modern monitors, although it looks bloody stupid doing so. Opening up a 610 is a straightforward but delicate procedure, achieved without any screws. There are two latches made out of plastic that must be gently pulled upwards. In my case, one release is fine, but the other has stuck firmer than an unflattering nickname in high school. This is old plastic, so simply applying brute force is a very effective way to break it. I resorted to using a blunt knife. Once released, the entire top comes off, and we can have a good gawp inside. The logic board sits across the back half of the case, alongside the power supply. The big grey square is the processor, which doesn't require any sort of cooling, although Sonnet did make an aftermarket 40 MHz replacement that required a heatsink. Can't be many of those left in the wild. Expansion card options are limited to a single processor direct slot. The best known use for this is a DOS compatibility card, which added an x86 processor and enabled users to run a DOS and or Windows instance at the same time, switching between them with a key combination. With the right converter, this slot could also become a NuBus slot, which opened up the 610 to all sorts of existing peripherals, so long as they were small enough. Well, I say all sorts, but in its initial review of the machine, Macworld noted that at that point in time, the only 7-inch NuBus cards available were for Ethernet. Nearby are 4 memory slots, with the ever so slightly smaller ones for video RAM. The single stick I have is for 32 MB, which combined with the 4 MB of memory soldered onto the logic board, reached 36. This is plenty for anything I could ever do with a 68K Mac, although clearly not for the previous owner. Back in 1993, RAM prices were immense. A 32 MB SIM was almost as steep as a 610 itself. However, one way around this, which I got boxed with the computer, was to install a program that just doubled it. 36 becomes 72. Unless of course I'm booting the machine from cold, because without 32-bit addressing, the RAM ceiling is 16. It took me a while to figure out what on earth was going on here. The documentation is deliberately coy about how it actually achieves its result, but it's basically a virtual memory technique that can page shift and intercept calls to RAM that are currently on the virtual disk in order to stop them crashing the system. RAM doubler wasn't the only thing that the 610 came with. I've got more documentation for this computer than every other machine I have, old and new, put together, including the manual that will have come with all Macs back in its day that explained System 7, a little addendum for additional features in 7.1, a booklet for the 610 itself, more booklets for the CD drive, monitor, warranty, and software licensing, something about TrueType fonts and how to manage them, and addresses for subsidiaries. Apple's small UK office includes the county of Middlesex in its address. This is interesting, as it was abolished in 1965. In addition, there's a big sleeve of floppy disks for installing printer software, the OS should that be necessary, and QuickTime. At the moment, this machine is running 7.1, and I think that's where it's going to stay. I've not used this version of the OS much, so one of the first things I did was fiddle with everything I'd never seen before, although getting it to work with my capture card was a bit trial and error. First, there was a massive black bar down the left, then it was yellow, and I spent ages trying to figure out why that was until realising the cable wasn't in properly. Yes. Moving swiftly on, here's a quick run through some of the control panels that were new to me. Be prepared for quite a considerable amount of ignorance here. Desktop backgrounds haven't changed from System 6, with a customisable grid of 8 pixels that is repeated across the screen. I actually found it quite tricky to find something that I was happy with. I messed around with this for ages. The Apple CD speed switch seems to be how users switch the optical drive between single and double speed. Supposedly, some things will only work with the slower option. Similar deal with the cache switch. I can't imagine a situation where it would break anything, but clearly it did, or this wouldn't be here. This map lets you find the location of major cities. Goodness knows why it's a control panel. Virtual Disk Starter is something the previous user put on. It's a free version of a cataloguing application which I think was fairly useful back when everyone had all sorts of files on various floppies and couldn't remember what was where. Views lets the user mess with how the Finder displays stuff, and aside from making the icons bigger in list view, is best left alone in my opinion. I suppose setting the font to wingdings has prank potential. With all the settings set and the hard disk cleared of all the old files that weren't needed, I could turn my attention to games. Obviously, physical copies that one possesses will work, but boxed Mac games are quite difficult to come by. Sure, there's always something or other listed at a completely unattainable price on eBay, but my game collecting is plodding forward at a sluggish pace, so to play a nice wide selection of titles, the abandonware sites are necessary. Something else I'm quite fond of are magazine cover discs. Although it's a bit potluck and generally limited to shareware, exploring these is a lot of fun, as they house all sorts of gems. The 610's overall compatibility with Mac software is fairly decent. The 25MHz chip ran most things that I threw at it at a fairly decent speed, and its ability to switch off 32-bit addressing enables it to run some older games that my faster 630 cannot, such as early games powered by World Builder. I think it's worth mentioning, however, that there actually aren't that many titles that this can play that won't also run perfectly fine on a newer G3 running OS 9. My overall take on the 610 is that it's a fairly generic Macintosh with solid enough performance but lacking in actual wow factor. The more interesting things that this computer can do, such as housing a DOS card or NUBUS video card, seem to be pretty rare, and you'll seldom find them without a hefty premium. Furthermore, the 660 is probably a more desirable option, which was one of these, with dedicated AV capabilities run by a 55MHz AT&T digital signal processor, which could also lend a hand with a handful of productivity programs that supported it. The 610 wouldn't be my first choice for a 68K Mac. Actually, to tell you the truth, I only got it because it came with a monitor. Just over 60 quid, local pickup. Prices seem to weave between here and 150, which I guess depends on how many buyers and sellers there are at eBay at any one time. It's a middle-of-the-road price for a middle-of-the-road experience, and for a lot of individuals, that's going to be all they need. While I would still suggest a 630 over this given the luxury of choice, as it's more abundant, easier to maintain, and a bit faster, a 610 would nevertheless suit someone looking to dip their toe into System 7 and its games very nicely. Its shape and size has a certain charm as well. This then concludes my look over this Macintosh Quadra 610. If you enjoyed it, you may well be interested in some of the other things I've done. Please leave a comment if you fancy plugging one of the many gaps of information that a 12-minute video inevitably leaves, as well as general thoughts, memories, corrections, and anything you disagree with. Thanks for watching then, and do stay tuned for further instalments of yesteryear's Macs.